All right, we'll begin. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to Marquette University Law School, the Lubar Center at Eckstein Hall. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who we say are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. Today we are joined by Rebecca Sandefur. She is Associate Professor of Sociology and Law at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She is also Faculty Fellow at the American Bar Foundation, where she founded and leads the foundation's Access to Justice Research Initiative. Last year, Professor Sandefur was named a MacArthur Fellow and was the recipient of what are commonly referred to as a Genius Grant from the MacArthur Foundation. That's for her work on inequality and justice. Professor Sandefur is being very generous with her time today. She's going to be in a featured conversation with me later this afternoon as part of our Posner Pro Bono Exchange, where we recognize the public service efforts of our students here at Marquette Law School. She is an undergraduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She got her doctorate at the University of Chicago. That's okay, thumbs up here. We're all in this together.
That's right.
We're all in this together. And she is going to be talking with us today about what she has called a crisis, and that is the need to increase the access to civil justice in our nation. So won't you please welcome Professor Rebecca Sandefur to Marquette Law School. Great to have you here. So Professor Sandefur is a sociologist, and so the question we'll begin with is, how did you end up writing and doing research about justice and access to justice?
So it was an accident, like most things. So I went to graduate school in sociology to study inequality, which I still do, but I was going to study inequality in education, particularly the way that social class inequalities emerge really early and schools kind of help bring them out, so how big social institutions work on inequality. And then, as so often happens in graduate school, I got involved in a project with a bunch of faculty principal investigators, and they had a lot of egos. And their egos resulted in the entire collapse of the project. And I was in my fourth year of graduate school, and I needed to write a dissertation. And so another faculty member called me and said, I need a research assistant on my project on the careers of lawyers in the city of Chicago between the 50s and the 90s. And I said, I need a job and a dissertation. This works perfectly. So I wrote a really boring dissertation on lawyers, not because of who you are, but because, you know, labor market theories and stuff like that. I'm sure it was tremendously important. But anyways, in writing that, I began to think about the role that lawyers play in our system, which is, to me, is kind of intriguing. So you have if you're not a lawyer, or even if you are, you have a public justice system that we've all already paid for. We've built the buildings, we've got the judges, we've salaried them, we've got file folders and clerks and all kinds of stuff. We have laws. But if you want to use that system, it's become so inward-looking and complicated that you have to go to a private third party and pay that private third party money to use your own justice system. And if you compare that to something like education, where I started, that we would think it was crazy if we said to every American, okay, there's a public school in your community and you can enroll your kid there as a resident, but in order to use that public school, you need to hire a private educational consultant that goes with your child to every class and meets with counselors to select courses. And when the kid gets in trouble, goes with them to the principal. Like, we don't expect that kind of mediation for other social institutions. And so I began to think about how does that shape people's use of law, their understanding of law, and then their access to justice.
So you've said, and I mentioned this earlier, there's a crisis in the access to civil justice. What do you mean by a crisis?
So it's a two-part crisis. So the judges can tell you one part of it, which is that most cases that make it to law, which is about 12% of civil cases, so not the majority of the activity, but most of those cases make it to state court systems that have been underfunded for the past 20, 25 years. And so even though they're only seeing a tiny part of the civil justice activity in the country, they're totally overwhelmed by, if we don't include traffic, it's 25 million cases a year, we guess. If we include traffic, it's like 50 million cases a year. It can take forever. They're poorly staffed. They're not well signed. They're unpleasant places to be. I'm sure your courts are lovely places to be, but, you know, like the Brooklyn Housing Court is horrible. It's a converted office building that smells like urine. I mean, it's terrible, right? And so that's a public building that represents justice to ordinary people. So that's part of the crisis, is that the system is not well resourced enough to do the work that it's currently doing. But the other part of the crisis is that other 88% of civil justice problems that never make it to the justice system, some of those are going just fine. Thank you very much. Like some of them people are resolving quite effectively and lawfully on their own. But there's a chunk of them that are happening in core areas of life around the care and custody of dependents, around your livelihood, around the security of your shelter, that we know aren't going well because we hear all kinds of stories of spectacular injustices and unlawful behavior. And so figuring out how to connect that set of problems, the set of problems that needs help and that's going down in ways we wish they wouldn't, with the right kinds of assistance is the other part of the crisis.
Elaborate, if you would, Professor, on the justice problems, and you just touched on several, but give us some concrete examples of the life experiences that people face, and then we'll talk about how they attempt to resolve them.
Sure. So if you think about this moment in history, we the people have made all kinds of laws about all kinds of areas of activity. So there are all kinds of laws about work, laws, regulations, rules about work, about when you can be evicted from your home and when you can't, right? We made rules about that. Rules about the way you can relate to your neighbors and you can't, the way that the government has to relate to you and you to it, and so on. And so we've made these rules because we think this activity is so important that we have a collective stake in how it plays out. So we want to regulate that. That's why we have laws. So since we regulate all this activity, buying and selling, working, living in a neighborhood, living in a house, getting out of a house, then every time you have something that goes wrong in one of those situations, it is, by definition, because we've set it up that way, a civil justice problem. And if you look at the most common kinds of civil justice problems that people have, at least in the surveys that we have in the sort of the U.S. and countries like the U.S., they're around employment. So a common one would go under the legal name of wage theft. But when I experience that as an ordinary person, it's my employer is a jerk because he's not paying me overtime, right? I should be getting that overtime and I'm not getting it. There are a lot of them around the security or the safety of housing. So habitability violations, but rats in my apartment or mold in my bathroom, or issues where I may not be current on payments that keep me in that house, and so now I'm at risk of eviction or foreclosure. As the population ages, more and more of us will be involved in situations with our relatives where you have a person who's elderly, and what we're learning is that actually, once upon a time, you were competent or you were incompetent. But now we realize that's not actually true. So there are people who may not be able to manage their own finances, but they can make their own medical care decisions, right? And so thinking that's a whole set of legal problems that goes under conservatorship and power of attorney and so on, and is about caring for the people that you love. And then if you go the other direction in the age structure, all around the country, there are all kinds of kids whose parents can't care for them because they're in jail, because they're addicted to drugs, because they have other kinds of problems that just make them not able to do that. And there are often other people around those kids who may be relatives or neighbors who are totally ready to step in and take care of them. But there's a whole set of legal instruments. Like, it seems like you should just be able to take your grandkid home and get them vaccinated and put them in school, but you can't, right? Because there are all kinds of regulations about who's able to do that. So there are whole sets of legal instruments that people need access to do those kind of very basic things that are a part of our daily lives.
Yeah, I was going to say, how common are these issues for the American population in general?
So in the last survey I did, which was in a middle-sized middle American city called Middle City, so smaller than Milwaukee, about 350,000 people, 2/3 of adults had at least one civil justice problem in the previous 18 months. A quarter of them a problem with employment, probably about 15% of them one of these different kinds of family issues that you might have. Another 18% would have some kind of housing issue. And then there are lots and lots of problems people have around money or buying and selling things. So disputes with different kinds of service providers or goods providers and so on.
Are certain folks more affected by these issues than others?
It's fascinating. So sociology teaches us that society has major dimensions of inequality, and the ones that we most often think about are race, social class, and gender. And so if you look at the distribution of just the experience of justice problems, civil justice problems, by race, social class, and gender, what you see is that people of color report more problems than white people. And women report more problems than men, and poor people report more problems than people who are not poor. But it actually is a bigger inequality than that. So in the survey that I did, if you said my employer's not paying me overtime, or I'm 2 months behind on my rent, or I have a grandchild and I need to figure out how to enroll them in school, right? So that's the justice problem. But you just described it as a situation in your life. So you have this situation in your life, and you say, okay, as part of that, has any of the following bad things happened? Like you've lost money, or somebody threatened you, or you lost your house, or you lost your job, or you had some kind of negative impact on your health. So then you can see sort of which problems lead to those bad outcomes, and then who has the problems with the bad outcomes. And that makes those inequalities of race, class, and gender even more starkly large. So that, for example, high-income people have lots of justice problems. I mean, 2/3 of Americans, we think, have justice problems, so high-income people are going to have them also. But the chances that their justice problems lead to one of these negative outcomes are like, I don't know, 1/3 of the chance that a poor person's problem does.
Yeah, and when you say negative outcomes, these can be game-changing moments. These can be catastrophic outcomes.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you lose your ability to make a living, if you lose your place to live, if you lose your ability to care for people who are dependent on you, that's bad enough in itself, but they often have sort of knock-on consequences that spiral into disaster.
So I think I heard you right. You said 88% of these kinds of legal problems are not handled by an attorney or don't go to a court hearing. What's the percentage on that again?
So it depends on which problems you ask about and which survey you're working with, but if you're thinking about law as either going to an attorney or being filed with a tribunal or a court, somewhere between 12 and 25% of problems will get there, will get to law, which means somewhere between 3/4 and 88% of problems will never get to those sources.
And so why is that? Because I'm sure people in this room and most people automatically think, well, attorneys are expensive. That's why people don't go see attorneys. Your research says a factor, but hardly the only factor.
It was a big surprise to me and then to everyone I talked to that there are attorney services that are actually quite expensive. Like those of you, I don't know who works in family law, but if you're doing a contested divorce where those parties are represented, that can be tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney's fees. I mean, that's an enormous amount of money. But there are lots of other attorney services that are quite inexpensive, like a simple will, that most Americans don't have anyways, even Americans who could afford that. And so the cost of services certainly plays a role, but another factor is the way people think about their justice problems. So in these surveys where, you say, are you 2 months behind on your rent, or whatever the specific life event is, if you say, okay, you've told me you're having this specific life event, what kind of problem is this? Is it a personal problem? Is it a moral problem? Is it bad luck? Is it God's will for you? Is it a legal problem? Is it a bureaucratic problem? The most common way that people describe their justice problems, that is those events that they could use law to respond to, the most common way they describe that in America is either bad luck or God's will. Now, if this is happening to me because it's just part of what I get, right? We all get some chunk of bad luck, and this is my chunk of bad luck. The way I'm going to handle that problem is very different than if I have a different story about it. Similarly, if I think not only is this just happening to me, this is supposed to happen to me, this is ordained, this is part of my path through life because a larger intelligence has given this event to me, filing a lawsuit is probably not the number one way I'm going to respond to that divinely ordained event in my life. And so that plays a really big role. Another way that people think about their problems that plays a really big role is, in this survey, again, if they said, okay, I have this problem, whatever kind of problem it is, did you go to anybody outside your immediate social network for help with this problem? Anybody, lawyer, not lawyer, or whatever, just like someone who's not close to you. If no, why not? And the 2 most common reasons people will give are, I didn't need any help, which implies I understand the situation and I know what I'm doing and I'm doing the things that make sense, or it wouldn't make any difference, which also implies I understand the situation and I know what I'm doing, and doing something would be a big waste of time. And the challenge, I think, for those of us who care about access to justice is that sometimes those people are totally right? I mean, I'm sure those of you who've counseled individual clients have said, don't file that lawsuit, right? It's just like it's a big waste of your time. But there are certainly circumstances in that bundle where people think they know what's going on, where people are wrong. That's why we have experts, right? That's like, you don't want me to take out your appendix, because I don't know where it is. And in the same way, lawyers have special expertise that lets them identify particular kinds of problems and think about what would be reasonable and lawful solutions to those problems. And sometimes people can make good guesses without expertise, but sometimes they can't. And so it's sort of matching that expertise with that sort of muddled chunk of problems that needs help that is our challenge, I think.
So who do they turn to resolve these issues? Family members? People they know, or?
So the most common thing they do is handle it on their own, because obviously they know what to do, right? So about 45% of these problems are resolved by people doing something by themselves. If they reach out, the first place they go is their immediate social network. So they go to family members, they go to friends, and then for about 22% of problems, they'll go outside that. And people are actually really creative when they go to third parties. So they go to church. They go to membership organizations like AARP. They go to constituent services for their various elected officials. They go to community organizations. And then occasionally, I think in my survey it was for 7% of justice problems, they go to attorneys.
So in some cases, it would seem that there might be a need for people to get legal advice. And yet, perhaps the people who need it don't see that they need legal advice. How do you connect the two? There are people in this audience who do pro bono work, people who work on these kinds of cases, probably think I could be of assistance. But to be of assistance, you have to have somebody ask you for help. How do we connect those?
Okay, so I'm going to start with the way we don't do it, and I'm going to tell you what we know about what works. So the immediate response to any of these kinds of problems is to think, wow, is there one big thing that we could do that could solve this problem? And so the one big thing that people often think of is, well, gosh, we could have really good civics education when people are 17 years old and teach them all about their rights, and then 35 years later, when they have some random justice problem, they'll totally make the connection between that abstract stuff from when they were 18 and this concrete life circumstance. Evidence suggests that is not the super effective way to do this. So what we see that is effective, which is, and this is the kind of the frustrating part of the no one solution thing, is people respond to interventions that are timely, so they show up when people recognize they are in trouble, that are targeted to the concrete problem that people understand themselves to have. So people do not want a large information packet about everything about housing law in the state of Wisconsin. They want to know, I got this thing in the mail, what does it mean? So timely, targeted, and it's got to come from some source that they trust, which is good and bad, right? So it gives you many, many points of outreach because we all have different things that we're connected to, but we're all connected to different things. And so you have to start to think about outreach strategies that get you into the different segments of the population that may not participate in this broad stuff. However, I do have an idea, and I want one of you to run with it, and that is this. So we do have opportunities to have public service announcements. And there have been public service announcements around legal issues. If you go onto YouTube, there's actually a really cool one about housing discrimination that educates both landlords and tenants about how you can't not rent to someone just because you think they're black or just because they say that they're a Jewish guy in a wheelchair, right? And they do this by having the actor call, basically in an audit study, a whole bunch, this apartment over and over again, this property management company, using different accents and pretending to be a different kind of person and giving a different name that signals being part of a different group in society. And in the end, when he puts on his white guy voice and says, this is Roger Phillips, I'm wondering if the apartment is available, suddenly it's available. And then the end of that ad is, hey, listen, everybody, this is against the law. It's called housing discrimination. You can't do it. Now, why couldn't we do that for a whole range of things that we want people to recognize in a targeted way? So I think wage theft is something that Americans can get, like if you work, you should be paid for it. Most Americans can get behind that. What if you ran a short series of interventions that said, run them for 18 months, you know, here's a situation, oh, by the way, that's actually wage theft, right? That's actually against the law, and your employer has to give you that money, and here's a way that you can respond to that situation. You'd run that for 18 months. It would catch people who were sort of paying attention to whatever your outlets were during that time, but then some of them would remember it. And so 2 years later, when their cousin had the same problem and was complaining about his horrible employer who wouldn't pay his overtime, you could say, well, you know, listen, there used to be this ad about this thing that you do, right? So you could imagine doing that over a period of time for issues that communities decide are worth investing that kind of energy in to get broader public recognition about them.
Bottom line, do we need more pro bono efforts, more attorneys who are willing to do civil law?
Absolutely. I think that we need two more different kinds of things. So there are regions in this country where there are no lawyers at all to serve the legal needs of ordinary people. And even though there are lots of things that people who are not lawyers and that computer programs can do, oftentimes you need a human being with specialized legal training to help you figure out what is going on and what your options are and give you some advice about how to handle it. And so that can happen because lawyers come out of Marquette and the University of Wisconsin and they decided they want to set up community practices in these places. There's some challenges of viability there, but you're smart people. But the other is that people, wherever they are, whether they practice in the city or in a smaller community, can donate some of their skills to their communities. And some of that will happen through direct service work, so you'd help a specific client with a specific problem. And some of it happens, big law firm pro bono can often be really effective. Big law firms are good at some things and not so good at other things. So if you've been doing high-end litigation in New York City for 20 years, you probably don't know anything about landlord-tenant law. So wouldn't it be a much better use of your incredible expertise to put it behind some kind of systemic litigation that's happening around housing law or around eviction, something like that? So I think there are all kinds of ways that lawyers can share their expertise. Sometimes it's going to be direct, and sometimes it's going to be in support of a bigger effort where they're part of a bigger team.
I want to ask you about something that's being discussed more and more, and we've discussed it in this room in the last year, and I talked to a couple of very prominent attorneys, Justice Goodwin Liu for the California State Supreme Court, and James Sandman, the head of Legal Services Corporation, which helps provide legal services to lower-income folks in this country. Both of them said that we need to look at non-attorneys to do some of the work that we've been talking about. You're a proponent of that. Why?
So all the evidence that we have shows that. Think about what you do as a big bundle. You're not all lawyers, but those of you who are lawyers, think about what you do as a big bundle of skills and expertise. And it's also attached to a set of capacities that you have that are reserved to you. So you can represent people in court, in negotiations. You can do things on their behalf. You can act as them. You can give legal advice. You can tell someone, this is what the law says, this is how it applies to your situation, this is what you should do. You can, you have privilege, so when I give you information in the context of our lawyer-client relationship, it's very hard to get that out of you. And then, of course, anybody can give legal information in this country. And finally, if you're a fully qualified attorney, you are, I love this, omnicompetent. So once you are in the bar, any place where you have rights of appearance, you may practice in any area of law. I hope that feels good. So when we look at the things that non-lawyers do, we don't say, let's have them do all of that, because that would be crazy. It would be like me taking out your appendix. But instead, you say, okay, what parts of that bundle can we pair off and give to people who have training that's less expensive, less intensive than everything it takes to become that qualified. And so you see all kinds of interesting models that, for example, use social workers who are trained in how the eviction court works, what the housing law says, and then they're also trained in when they should not take this case. Right? So there are some cases that have complex legal defenses, and if you don't have legal training, you shouldn't take those cases, right? So you're sort of trained to refer them to an attorney. And then those social workers work cases in the Brooklyn housing courts. They select the same cases that legal aid lawyers do. So people who are in trouble, who you can help, who are eligible for the various things that would make them helpable. People who have significant disabilities, maybe people who have linguistic issues with the language of the court. So they select those same kinds of cases, and they do two things. So one is they use their social worker skills to connect people to all kinds of benefits and services that they're eligible for but not receiving that will let them pay the rent. Because that eviction case is usually not about really wanting you to leave. It's about wanting you to pay me. So making it possible for the tenant to pay turns out to be a really valuable service that the social workers can provide. And then the other thing that the social workers do is they don't appear and they don't argue, but they can accompany. So they can go with tenants when they meet with the landlord's attorney to hammer out the informal agreement. They can go to meet with the court attorney because New York City has a court attorney system, and then they can go when the person appears in front of the judge, and they can answer factual questions that the judge directs to the navigator. So they can't make arguments, but if the judge says, does Mrs. So-and-so have a receipt for the rent, the navigator can reach into the big plastic sack of receipts and pull it out and say, it's right here. And so the idea is this makes it easier for the court to get the information it needs to make a decision, and it makes it easier for the tenant to fulfill their side of the access to justice deal, which is I sign this lease and I pay this rent. So when that was running in its first year as a pilot project, it had a 100% success rate. That is, every client that they took did not get evicted. Now, if they were serving all 59,000 people that come through the Brooklyn housing courts in a year, I doubt they would have had that success rate.
Do we know how many cases there were when you say 100% success rate?
That was 158. Selected the same way. Legal aid lawyers don't take every case either, right? So they're selected the same way. And the cost is about half of a legal aid lawyer in New York City. Now, does that mean we should replace all lawyers with these navigators? No. But what it means is there's a chunk of cases in this example in the housing world, that people who have a little bit of training in law and some other important training in kind of solving this problem can handle very, very effectively. And so I think there will never be, there's this great calculation about how many hours of pro bono American lawyers would have to do in order to give 1 hour of legal assistance to every American who needs it, and it's something like I should have looked this up, but it's something like you'd have to do, each of you, 350 hours of pro bono a year? I'm sure you have other plans, right? I mean, it's just that's just not a sustainable model for solving the whole problem. So sort of thinking about how to put together a portfolio of solutions where you use lawyers when lawyers are useful, and then you use other kinds of personnel or tools when those would be just fine.
A couple of questions. What were the origins of that program that you're talking about in Brooklyn? How did that come to be? Who had the idea for it?
So it had two births, as with things that are part of big initiatives. So its second birth was as part of Chief Judge Jonathan Lippman's Access to Justice push in New York City. And so what happened was he wrote if you're thinking about this in your jurisdiction, so Lippman had the chief administrative judge for the state write a rule, I love this is so lawyerly, write a rule that says there's no rule change that has to happen for this to happen in the courts. You can go to the state court website and see it. And so that was sort of this big launch of this idea, and there was a big task force on non-lawyers and the justice gap. But it had started as a program started by the chief administrative judge of the city, who at that time was Fern Fisher, who said, there are all these people wandering around the housing courts, they don't know where they're going, there's no signs, they're lost, everyone's getting mad at them, they're annoying the clerks by asking all these questions. Let's create a volunteer program where people just kind of help you move around the space and explain what's going to happen. And so that was the RAP, the Respondent Assistance Program. And it had been in operation for a while. And then when this big Access to Justice initiative came through, it got rebranded as Court Navigators and expanded to have kind of more powers. Sort of the social workers are like super navigators.
Second question, how was it funded? Where did the money come from?
Now, if any of you work
always the money, isn't it? Yeah.
Work in legal aid or in other sources of human and social services that rely on philanthropy, you know that the trough is very shallow and many heads are trying to get into it. So this was funded partly by the courts, but mostly by private foundations that were interested in intervening in housing, in making the courts want procedural justice, they want to make things more fair, and they want to make court processes more efficient, and then foundations want to protect people from homelessness and preserve the stock of low-income housing and things like that. And so that's how that began. Then New York City passed a law. You probably may know, well, you may know, that New York City has a right to counsel for people facing eviction from their homes who are at, I think it's 200% of poverty and below. So once that law was passed, we didn't need navigators anymore, right? Because everybody's going to get an attorney. Now, when you're thinking about the right to counsel that you want to implement in your community, you have to think about when that right to counsel kicks in. So that navigator kicked in the moment you showed up to file your answer to the eviction summons that you received at your home. In New York State, that answer must assert every possible defense that you will ever use in the course of that case. So it's a pretty important moment. The attorney doesn't show up when you file the answer. You're on your own filing the answer because all the navigators are gone, because we don't need them anymore, apparently. The attorney shows up when you, just like in a criminal case, when you have your first appearance in front of the judge, where lots of things that might have helped you out have not happened because you haven't had any assistance during that time. And so I don't think anyone meant for this to be the way that that went down. But again, you could imagine a different world, a world where there were navigators who helped you file the answer, there were navigators who took the cases that navigators could handle, and there was a way to refer the other ones to legal aid. So instead of everybody having a lawyer, everybody got assistance with the problem.
This is a very innovative approach, but you made the comment earlier, depending on where you live, my guess is this is fairly rare. What's happening in New York has not happened in many, if any, other places around the country.
So that's a great question. A colleague of mine has tried to find every navigator-like program in the country. And there's one kind of navigator-like program that's been around for decades that many of you are probably familiar with, which is domestic violence advocates. So these are people who are not attorneys, they have some training, the reason they've been around forever is because there's a dedicated source of federal funding that supports these programs, and they assist people who are trying to get orders of protection and move through different processes around that particular problem. So there are lots of those, and they're all over the place. But then if you look at similar kinds of programs in other areas of law, she could find 23. I think they're in the country. I think they're in 16 different states. Some of them are multi-site within their state. Some of them are not. They're in a super wide range of areas of law. So family, housing, mortgage foreclosure, Social Security. There's another wacky one I can't remember. Debt, consumer debt. There are a number of consumer debt programs. So it's pretty clear that jurisdictions think there's a lot of different ways in which these things can be implemented and different kinds of services they can provide, but it's not yet sweeping over the nation.
There's something that's been happening in Washington State that I'd like you to talk about, and this is I don't know, when I always think of some of this discussion, you think of it in terms of, for a doctor, we now have physician assistants. Do we have anything like that? Is Washington State an example of something that's analogous to that? So
that's a great question. So if you think about these navigator programs, they're almost all nonprofits, and they're almost all not charging for their services, which means, and they're also almost all serving people where there's no private legal services market anyway, so no one cares that you're giving free semi-legal services to people. You're not competing with anybody. But Washington State decided that its model for expanding access to justice was going to include a new kind of, they think of them as lawyers. I always call them, this always makes them mad, junior varsity lawyers. And the reason I call them this is because they cannot play in the big leagues. So if you think about that big bundle of things that a lawyer can do, so you're not omnicompetent if you're one of these things. You have a limited competence. It's family law only, and only some parts of family law. But within that scope, you can enact things on your client's behalf. You can give legal advice. You have a lawyer-client relationship that gives you privilege, but you can't represent. So you can't represent people, this is people involved in divorces or negotiations of custody after divorce. You can't represent either in court or with the other party. So the way they set up this program, they were thinking of lawyers when they set it up. So you can see that they've sort of made this junior varsity lawyer, and then they were thinking about providing all the sources of legitimacy that give lawyers their legitimacy. So you have a paralegal degree from a community college, you take 3 courses in a law school on family law, and then you take 3 bar exams: the ethics bar exam, the general bar exam, and a bar exam that's special to the family law area. And then you're certified as a limited licensed legal technician, and you can practice independently.
What's the name again?
They call them triple LTs. It's a limited licensed legal technician. It should be a cheer.
Does that inspire confidence in the people who use them?
Well, this is an interesting thing. So with a colleague, Tom Clark from the National Center for State Courts, we did an evaluation of this particular model. And so once consumers can find them, they love them. Because it's essentially an unbundled legal service. And so if you have a good triple LT, they explain to you what they're going to do and what you're going to do and what's going to happen. And so you have good expectations. You keep control of part of the issue. It's much cheaper than a lawyer. It's like a little bit more than a paralegal's hourly rate. But consumers have no idea why these people can do some things and lawyers can do other things. Like those sort of lines make no sense to a consumer. And like I don't know what a limited license legal taxation is, except because I wrote a study on them, right? Like it's not a brand that makes any sense to an ordinary person. And again, I think that's because they were really thinking about legitimacy with the bar. So this is a limited license. They're not real lawyers. Rather than legitimacy with the public. And there has been a really slow rollout of that program for that reason.
Is it promising?
I think it's over-regulated. I think 3 bar exams, buy malpractice insurance, be a member of the Washington State Bar, that seems extreme to me. But I do think one thing that's really important to think about as these roles proliferate is what is the smart way to regulate this activity? So in the UK, they've done something wacky, like those wacky Brits do, where instead of regulating in advance by saying this group of workers can do this and this group of workers can do this, they do entity regulation, so they regulate whatever organization gives the service, and they tend to do it on the other side. They're like, instead of telling you exactly how to do your work, like can you give legal advice or not, because anyone in the UK can give legal advice, they say, we want to see that the following bad things don't happen. And when those bad things happen, you will be in serious trouble. But until then, good luck, right? And so thinking about how, like I do not want consumers to not be protected from bad practice. But sort of thinking about what the smart, rational, efficient way to do that is, I think is a little bit challenging, but not impossible. If there's anyone who can make up rules, it would be y'all. So.
How can, or I guess maybe I'll just say, can new technologies help bridge the justice gap?
So there are all kinds of, I locked some undergraduates in a room and made them find every legal technology that they could. It helps that the room is windowless, otherwise they get distracted. And so we found 330 tools that purport to assist someone who is not an attorney with some kind of justice problem. And they're all over the map. So there are tools that will help you with criminal problems. There are tools that will help you with family problems. There are lots of tools that help you make a document. Lots of tools that will give you lots and lots of information in the form of very long, dense articles that no one could ever possibly read. What we know about the best interventions, going back to timely, targeted, and trustworthy, and this idea that people don't know that their problems are legal. So the coolest tools would be tools that you could find or connect with around the problem as you understand it, and that would help you diagnose that problem as something you might want to do something about. And so my favorite example of that is a tool that comes out of New York City, then you can pull it up on your phone later. You can pull it up on your phone now. I teach undergraduates. I'm used to it. It's fine. And it's called Just Fix. And the way it's presented to the public is, are there some problems with your apartment that you'd like your landlord to just fix? And so it takes you through a guided interview that asks very specific questions like, are there rats in the basement? Is there mold in the bathroom, et cetera? And then it says, okay, done with section 1. You've said there was mold in the bathroom. Take your cell phone, because we know you have one, and go take a picture of it. Go in the basement and take a picture of the rats. Okay, then you press done. And then it writes a letter. Dear landlord, I'm a tenant in your unit at this address. I'm letting you know that under New York City Housing Code blah, 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 there are the following violations of housing code in my apartment. Rats, mold, whatever, whatever, whatever. And by the way, appendices A through K of this letter are the date stamped, time stamped, geolocation stamped photos documenting that these are the conditions in my apartment, the one you're responsible for. I'm letting you know that, under city ordinances, you have this much time to respond. By the way, you got to give me 72 hours notice before you come in the apartment. Look forward to hearing from you soon. Love, your tenant. And then the nonprofit that pushes out that that tool will mail a certified letter for you to your landlord. Now that's a really cool tool. It does one thing, right? It's very focused on one particular thing. It addresses the problem as people understand it, and then the challenge is getting people to use it. So the way that JustFix has done that is by doing outreach through community organizations and tenants unions, because those are trusted conduits of ways to solve problems. And then the other thing about technology is that younger people are not necessarily better at using it than older people, but they're more comfortable using it than older people. So they also have a grandparent program. So like get your grandma to use JustFix, or help your grandma use JustFix on her phone. So even though you can create this very sophisticated tool, you still end up with this very human social problem of connecting it to the people who have the issue that it's meant to help.
So we're talking about different approaches to increasing access to justice. What's been the legal profession's response to the possibility of more non-attorneys, the possibility of new technologies playing a role that some people would probably think is traditionally the role of the attorney?
So I think it depends on where you are looking in the bar, because the bar is actually quite differentiated. You're all doing different kinds of work, and you have to, working for different kinds of organizations. And so as long as what non-lawyers or robots are doing is not playing in a place where lawyers are currently selling services to human beings, no one cares, right? There's no sense of competition. None of the people using JustFix were hiring private attorneys to write those letters anyways, so who cares? Once you start to nudge into places where there are lawyers who make money doing this, then the bar starts to think that this is the unauthorized practice of law. One of the things that I find really interesting when I listen to those arguments is those of you who are in corporate practice know that lots of what lawyers used to do is now done by accounting firms and consulting firms. And so that spread has already happened at the top end. It doesn't seem super surprising that it would happen at the bottom end, especially when there's not a lot of innovation on the part of the private practice bar to go out and provide those services at levels that ordinary people feel like they could pay for. So I think it's going to be, so how will JustFix get embattled, right? So it'll get embattled not because this bunch of tenants lawyers who don't exist file some kind of lawsuit against them. They'll get embattled because the landlord's bar figures out that this is what is happening. And then they'll decide that this is the unauthorized practice of law, which is why I think it's really important to right now, because this stuff is just going to proliferate, think about what the smart regulation scheme for this activity would be to prevent this kind of nonsense, which is just a distraction from real stuff, I think.
I've got just a couple of questions left, and then we'll take 10 minutes of questions from the audience. So you got one of these genius grants from the MacArthur Foundation. You're a MacArthur Fellow. What have you been doing with the award? What have you been, the kind of work you've been focusing on since being given that honor?
So one of the great things about those kinds of experiences is you've been saying the same things, but now somehow they're interesting. And so I think it's a really wonderful, the access to civil justice has been off the radar in the U.S. since we sort of called it on the war on poverty, right? We didn't win, we just called it. And so this is a great chance to sort of bring an issue that people haven't been thinking about back onto the radar to get us thinking about it and working on it again. So I've been doing that. And then the other thing I think about, I hope this isn't too in the weeds for those of you who are not in this area. So I often imagine I could get in an elevator with an ordinary person and be like, what would you like, justice or injustice? And they'd be like, justice, sure, bring it. And if I asked them what that meant, like what that response would be a million different things, but it wouldn't be anything abstract. And so part of the mistake we made in the access to justice world in the old days and now is trying to sell the public imagination on an abstraction like access to justice. I think the next step for me, and so this is what I'm doing with Mac money, I guess we could call it, is thinking about what are legal issues that many groups in the population have. So why do we still have Social Security? Because we all pay in and we all get money back, right? So what are the kinds of civil justice problems that lots and lots of different groups are experiencing? And then how can we set up demonstration projects in specific places with really existing people and really existing stakeholders that show, hey, access to justice is a solution to this problem that we can all agree is worth solving. And the way you provide it is by some rules changes and some non-lawyers and some technology and some more legal services. And look, we pulled it off, and then you study how you pulled it off, and then you study whether it does what you want it to do, and then the next jurisdiction can do it better. And so the places that I think are really ripe for that are debt, because everybody's got it, and there are all kinds of debt that we think are just fine. Like the student loan debt is an investment in your future. It's going to crush your future, but it's an investment in your future. And that's going to be a crisis, and we're going to have to figure out what to do about it, and part of that is going to involve legal interventions. I think the other goes back to something we talked about right at the beginning, which is you have all these people who, for different reasons, can't 100% care for themselves, and there isn't necessarily a clear person who can care for them. So the powers of attorney, guardianship, conservatorship, those are all things that are legal that people have to do those very human, caring things. And I think that, and it happens to every group in society, and so I think that's another place that's ripe for creating interventions that will help a lot of people, but also like show this is a valuable thing to be working on.
So I hear you saying there's not one big idea that's going to fix this problem. It will be a combination of different approaches.
Absolutely.
My final question is this, and it sort of plays off what you just said, and the interest in the notion of increased access to civil justice. We were talking about this in my office before we came down, and I said, you know, we just went through a governor's race here in Wisconsin where we talked a lot about criminal justice reform. And even in the very early stages of the 2020 presidential campaign, we see a focus on criminal justice reform. Has the need for access to civil justice been overshadowed by the attention, perhaps unintentionally, but by the attention that has been given to the criminal justice reform debate?
I don't think, I mean, the criminal justice system in this country is a disaster, right? I mean, it's inefficient, it makes lots and lots of horrible mistakes, and it's biased in all kinds of ways that violate the values that we all have. And so it's worth all of that attention and all of that, it's going to be a big issue in the upcoming campaigns, and it should be. I think rather than feeling sort of pushed aside by criminal justice, I think this is a really great moment to bring civil justice back into the conversation. And one of the things that I find inspiring about the fact that we're all talking about criminal justice reform now is that we're all talking about criminal justice reform now. So it's no longer a left-wing, bleeding heart issue that only socialists care about, right? The Koch brothers care about criminal justice reform. And so thinking about how that took a while, it took 20, 25 years, but how that got pulled off, I think is an important model for those of us who care about civil justice to think about how to make that an issue that lots and lots of different constituencies would engage with as a problem to be solved.
I'm always struck by how many people seem to believe they've watched a lot of television, so they think that, you know, just like a criminal case, you have an attorney for a civil case. Of course you're entitled to an attorney, but that shows our lack of even understanding of some of the issues we face today.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to take some questions from the audience. Here's the way we do this. If you're in the seating bowl, press down on that little black box in front of you. We'll all be able to hear your question. If you are seated in the back, wait for Ryan. He has a microphone. He'll hold the microphone and you can ask your question. Since we only have 10 minutes or so, I ask that the questions be brief, but you're free to ask whatever you'd like. No speeches, please. That would be the only requirement. So raise your hand if you have a question for Professor Sandefur. I'll start right there. Yes. Push down on the, yeah. Thank
There?
you. Yep. Just keep
How is it on?
Yes.
We found you.
Okay. You mentioned 158 cases that involved evictions, where you had a 100% success ratio based upon the fact nobody was evicted. Did all of those cases, number one, involve money? And number two, did they pay the landlords back the money? And if so, how were these 158 cases, how did they come up with the money? Was it part of this private funding? How did it happen?
Sure. So all of the cases that any kind of navigator worked were always evictions for non-payment of rent, which is the most common reason that landlords file eviction. And then in terms of where the money came from all over the place. Right, so part of how you can get a landlord to say, okay, we can do this repayment plan where, you do the last couple months' rent, and maybe I'll forgive part of it, is by saying, look, dude, we can show you that this person can reliably pay rent going forward and will not be a problem tenant for you. And so then that's maybe connecting to an emergency eviction prevention grant to solve the arrears, but it's much more importantly saying, wow, this is a veteran who's eligible for XYZ benefit and wasn't collecting it, now they have it. Or this is a family that has adult children living with an elderly parent, and the adult children are working, but they're not contributing to the rent. So they would bring in family counselors to be like, hey, listen, this rent thing's pretty important. Let's all get on board for making that happen. And so that was how they achieved those successes. Was by creating arrangements, so there are big stipulations that come out of all of these cases, creating arrangements so that the parties involved and the judge believed that going forward, this wasn't going to be a problem.
But were the arrears paid?
Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't.
And you would call that 100% success because no one was evicted, but the landlord, who still has to pay property taxes and things like that, would you call that a success for that person?
Well, the landlord could have said, I'm not playing, the landlord didn't have to take the deal, right? So these are deals that landlords accepted as part of the workout of these cases. So if they made irrational choices, I don't know. I don't have the information to make that judgment on their behalf, but they were willing to participate in that resolution.
We take other questions. Right there.
Hi, I work at Legal Aid Society of Milwaukee, and we represent low-income residents of Milwaukee County. And we normally go to small claims court where almost all of the low-income consumers deal their legal issues. And as of like 2017, 95% of those cases were uncontested, which means that almost all of them didn't fight back. So as you mentioned earlier in your presentation, we can help those who come for help, but we can't help those who don't seek assistance. So for like legal service corporation like us, how can we encourage people to come to us and seek legal advice?
So are the cases that you're talking about debt cases?
It includes consumer cases and eviction cases all together.
Okay. So if you're thinking about this from the position of the member of the public, sometimes default is totally rational, right? So you can make a judgment against me, but if I'm a turnip, I have no blood. And people may sometimes make that rational decision not to appear when they're in a case, rational from their perspective. But then the broader issue you're asking is you can get very high default rates, particularly in consumer debt, but also in eviction. And so then what's the way to help, even if people don't eventually appear, to connect them with advice and information about the situation that they're in and how they might think about how to respond. And it goes back to not the triple LT, but the triple T of timely, targeted, and trustworthy. So where are the places that the people you want to serve, where do they go? Do they go to community centers? Do they go to church? Do they go to tenants organizations? Can you do outreach with those places so that those frontline service providers know that you are also available to assist? There are also, there are some interesting experiments with getting the list of court filings when it comes out and then notifying every single person who receives the debt claim or the eviction notice that in very plain language, using cartoons, hey, here's what just happened to you. And by the way, XYZ legal assistance organization can help you with this thing that's just happened to you that's now been described in words that make sense to you as opposed to all the legalese that's in that legal document. That's a more expensive outreach than identifying specific points of entry around the community, but both of them are trying to target the people who have the problem right when they have the problem.
Other questions? How about right there in the middle in the back?
Thanks. Hi. I also work in a legal services organization, Legal Action of Wisconsin, and you've talked about a number of different potential models of access to justice, both the court navigator type programs and potential introduction of technology. I guess I'm wondering, how do you actually measure whether and which of these programs are working? Is it outcomes based? Is it whether it's you tackle somebody in the elevator and ask them what justice means to them? Is it if it's measuring up to their definition of justice? How are we thinking about that so we can evaluate it?
Sure, that's a great question. When I think about one major criteria of evaluation for me, it's kind of low level, but I think it's really important in the space, is use, right? Can you get anybody to use this service or tool at all? I think that's one really important question to ask. And then when you start to think about effectiveness, which is what we usually think about when we think about evaluating something, like does it do what we want it to do as opposed to some other thing? Then we also often think about efficiency. So when is the lawyer what you need versus this computer program versus a packet of forms, right? Most of our evaluation studies just look to see whether that program is either different from nothing or does what it says it will do. But I think there's another whole set of questions that we usually ignore, and so one of them is about sustainability. So all these things that start as pilot programs funded by foundations have serious sustainability problems, because that foundation is going to get bored and move on to another issue, which is how foundations roll, that's fine. And so then finding a way to think about what a stable source of support would be for a program that is useful is very challenging. Part of that problem emerges because of the UPL restrictions. Just imagine if those navigators could charge me a fee for assistance with my problem with my landlord and cross-subsidize their services to someone else with that fee, right? So that would be a different model of sustainability, which is something I think we can guess about sustainability. We can guess these things aren't sustainable, but there's very little research on that. And then the final thing is scaling. So JustFix is an awesome tool. However, housing law is different in every municipality. So how easy and hard is it to translate that tool into a different place? That outreach strategy, which is genius, is incredibly labor intensive because you're forming all these personal relationships between the nonprofit and the points of entry to the community. How do you scale this stuff when we have, how many counties are there? 3,175? That's 3,175 court systems, right? That in some states have distinct forms. And so the coordination issue of making this stuff scalable is actually really quite spectacular. So I think your question about evaluation is a great one. I think there's actually a lot of things we should know more about.
I am actually going to wrap things up there because we have the CLE continuing at 1:15 today. So what I'm going to do is mention that Professor Sandefur will be out in the forum area for about 15 minutes, and then she has a 1:30 meeting that she has to go to. So the people who are here for the CLE, stay in the room. Other folks, clear the room as soon as possible. That would be great. Before you go, let me say this. We greatly appreciate your interest and your attention and your good questions for this event. Thank you for being with us, and most of all, thanks to our guest today, Professor Rebecca Sandefur.
Yeah, one at a time. Okay. Okay. And just come one at a time. I think she wants us to get up one at a time. You can right here. Line up. Yep. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for those of you exiting quickly. I appreciate it very much. The second part of the program will start shortly with Chief Judge Maxine White. So those of you who are remaining for the program, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm going to ask those of you who are not remaining to continue your conversations in the hallway so that we can meet the promise that we made to our guests here today who are expecting CLE credits from this fabulous program, so that we do not disturb the hall of the conversation in the greater hall. We're going to close the doors. I want to thank all of you for coming today. These words of timely, targeted, and trustworthy must have been written for us today, because in December of last year, the Eastern District received a charge led by U.S. Magistrate Judge Nancy Joseph, who joined with some of the rest of us asking for support for a major new cause of, quote, collecting information and ideas from an army of attorneys to help with civil justice in this nation and in each of the Eastern District, but also in all of the 95 U.S. attorney districts throughout the land. And so we're so pleased that we're part of this. The flyer that you received at your registration lists the Power Act Committee member organizations. The Milwaukee Bar was powerful in getting us here today. The Milwaukee Community Justice Council, Legal Action of Wisconsin, Milwaukee Justice Center, Marquette Volunteer Legal Clinic, Sojourner Family Peace Center, the Eastern District of Wisconsin, the Clerk of Court, and the U.S. Magistrate Judge who leads this effort, and then the Milwaukee County Circuit Court. Our membership on the Power Act Committee also included the public defender as well as the district attorney for Milwaukee County and others like the Marquette Law School leadership of the legal clinic with Dean Schultz. But we had about, I want to make sure I don't miss anybody. I got all of the organizations on the list, and I want to thank all of you for the work that you've done. And so what we have here today in the last few minutes is an opportunity for what the flags fly about around Milwaukee and this university say, be the difference. So we're going to see if we can get some Power Act talk going past today to figure out how we can be the difference in some of those areas that Dr. Sandefur talked about. I'm going to present to you now U.S. Magistrate Judge Nancy Joseph.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chief Judge White, and thank you to all our partners. I don't want to restate because we have a very limited amount of time. All the partners who worked so hard, some of them represented here and throughout the room, to make this successful state and federal joint venture. So we thank you very much. So when you signed up for the CLE and when you arrived here today and in your packet and throughout the program today, you've been hearing this Power Act. And it's not a new Marvel movie. It's actual new federal legislation. The Power Act was passed in January of last year, January 2018, and it's an acronym for Pro Bono Work and Represent Act. Congress acknowledged and recognized that one area of crisis is the area of domestic violence and sexual assault. So Congress has passed this act asking that the federal courts partner with the different communities in bringing light to this crisis and in recruiting this army of lawyers who can do pro bono work in this area. I'll leave you with one statistic that I think represent the crisis. For example, in just one day, 10,000 requests for services and legal representation went unanswered. So that kind of gives you a little peek in just one day where the need is. And what we also know from the information that Congress gathered in passing this legislation is that those who were represented, about 83% who were represented, victims who were represented in getting protective orders, 83% were successful in getting their protection orders. By comparison, only 32% or so were successful in getting protective order when they're not represented. So again, the need is great, and some of our partners are here today to tell you some opportunities where you can get involved in assisting in this area or passing the word on, because each of you also have your own armies behind you that you can help us in recruiting in this effort. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So to that end, my name is Angela Schultz, and just in 1 minute, I'm going to make sure everyone in this room is aware of the Marquette Volunteer Legal Clinics. I see many active volunteers here, so I know many of you already are. But the Marquette Volunteer Legal Clinics operate almost every day of the week, including our partnership with the Milwaukee Justice Center's mobile legal clinic. It's an opportunity for lawyers to get out and about in the community, sit down with folks, answer questions, and make a difference. People are nodding their heads, so if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to me or reach out to many of your colleagues who are already involved in doing that work. That's it.
Hi, so my name's Julie Yato. I work at Sojourner, and my main goal today is simply to say thank you. I'm the Associate Director there of Advocacy. I'm also a volunteer attorney in my free time, but I'm here in my advocacy hat. And I talk to a variety of clients who have received pro bono legal services and ask them what they wanted you to know. And more than anything, they wanted you to be thanked. The pro bono legal services that you provide matter because it makes them feel like they matter. So just a few quick things I wanted to highlight from my discussion with them. More than anything, they're completely overjoyed to receive the help, and it's really regardless of the outcome. Certainly they want a positive outcome, but they really just appreciate somebody being by their side and, again, making them feel like they matter. They also said that they felt heard, both by their attorney and with their attorney's help by the judge, by the court, and by their abuser. They mentioned that they had some of their stress alleviated from feeling like they needed to understand any of the legal jargon that was going on around them, and that was a real stress reliever. And not only representation, but they really appreciate all of the other kinds of support that they've received. So any kind of brief conversation, legal advice, help filling out paperwork. They also talked a lot about just help understanding legal documents that they've received and issue spotting. Many of them told me about how they would come to an attorney thinking that they needed help with one thing, and the attorney helped them realize they actually had about 5 areas that they could get support around. So that was a really important piece that they wanted me to highlight. What we wanted you to know at Sojourner is that while we're here primarily to support survivors, we're also here to support you if you need our help. So let us know if there are things that we can be doing to support you as you support clients. And finally, just a few very quick quotes. Some of the women who I spoke with said my lawyer was my lifeline. I felt like I mattered. I had someone on my side telling my abuser what he did wasn't okay and that he wasn't going to get away with it again. And lastly, my favorite, when I walked in the courtroom, I felt like I had a superpower. I would think something, and then my attorney would say it in a way that the judge understood. I felt like I had a protective shield around me that day. And end of that conversation, I wanted to mention, she had said, she'd asked me, why do only judges get to, well, wear robes? She had called them dresses. And I said, there might be some judges in the room when I talk, so let's not cause any fights. But she had suggested that, you know, let's let the judges continue to wear their robes. But she felt like, it was her recommendation, that any lawyers who provide pro bono legal services should get to wear capes so that people can recognize that they're superheroes. So.
Hello, my name is Janelle Dame. I'm a staff attorney with the Volunteer Lawyers Project at Legal Action of Wisconsin. So the Legal Action of Wisconsin is a legal services provider for the southern part of the state of Wisconsin, and the Volunteer Lawyers Project coordinates pro bono opportunities throughout that service area. So one of the pro bono opportunities that we provide is representation to people who are seeking protection in a domestic abuse injunction, and we do that through our staff attorneys and also through our pro bono efforts on Thursday afternoons, which is a new project as of February, and then also on other days of the week that may not be Thursdays. And the representation on Thursdays is an expansion of Quarles and Brady's Tuesday afternoon project. And we're doing this in partnership with Sojourner Family Peace Center. And we receive referrals of clients with injunction hearings on Thursdays from them. And we prepare the file for free representation at their injunction through our volunteer attorneys. And we are doing this work because there's a very high need in Milwaukee County for injunctions and representation in those injunctions. Through our Thursday afternoon project, we receive up to 5 referrals each week. Our project began in February, and just some loose numbers, we've received about 40 cases, and we've concluded 33 of them. About half of that, the clients, we didn't end up representing. They either were not eligible, or they did not want representation, or they did not follow through with the intake or appearing at their hearing. But for the rest who did appear and were interested in representation, we've been able to represent 17 of them successfully, which is really fantastic. So if any of you are interested in providing representation, we'd be super excited to have you join our project. It's a lawyer for a day limited scope model, so we prepare all the files in advance with help from Angela's students who do some of the intake for us, and then legal action helps with service issues, so does Sojourner, and then the students also help gather up any additional evidence such as photographs or police reports or anything like that. So you would be getting a file ready to go, prepared for representation in court on Thursday with the client. There's a sign-up sheet if you're interested in your packet, and you can fill it out now and give it to me, and I'll take it back to the office and get you hooked up with some great clients, or you can email it as well. So hopefully you'll join us, and thank you very much for all your work and other pro bono opportunities. So thank you.
Judge Joseph has a few things to remind you of. I want to thank everybody who worked on getting us here today, and all of you who came to listen and learn today, and remind you that you have 46 branches of the court. We have 10 commissioners on the 7th floor. We have 5 judges who specialize in family law. We have a family bar, bench bar organization, and we are willing and ready to teach anyone who wants to brown bag in the conference room at the courthouse with us to learn this area, remove your fears, and put on your capes. Just let me know if you want a private session, if you want your law firm to have a session. We have people that can help you understand the area, any area that you're interested in volunteering for in any other way.
I have to remind you, otherwise Marquette Law School will not let me back in the building. Please fill out your evaluations and leave it here. And then lastly, of course, thank you so much for coming. The Power Act Committee we are required to do such programmings every year, one addressing state need in the domestic violence area, and one in Native American communities. So if you have ideas, or you are doing something in that area you think the Power Act Committee should be involved in or should know about, please let us know. You know how to find me. Thank you very much for coming. Have a great afternoon.